The narrative device of a silent protagonist is a deeply embedded trope in the medium of video games, and not just for reasons involving early technical limitations, but also because it's something of a natural choice to make with a game's narrative design, as it makes a lot of sense to do what you can as a developer, as a creator, to put the player into the game, to actualize the experience to a significant degree, since this is an interactive medium. And silencing the protagonist is a simple, effective way of doing this, as it intuitively lets the player know that they're meant to be the voice of this character, that in essence, this character is them, and in turn, they are this character. That this character is simply a vehicle for the player to get as close to the game world as possible with. But thankfully, this grandiose, ideal notion isn't the only reason you see silent protagonists, as there are more important, tangible reasons as to why a game might feature a silent protag over a spoken one, that based on contextual and holistic reasons, such as the desired key features or the creator's artistic intent, that either a silent protag would simply be beneficial in such a case, or because a spoken one would be detrimental, strange, or just unnecessary to the overall vision. Games with character creators and or multiplayer elements are strong case types where all this reasoning works well. Monster Hunter, the Souls games, and just about every MMO come to mind here, though the MMO part did not stop RuneScape from having a spoken protagonist, but anyway. Games that focus on gameplay and adventure versus heavy story and character elements, even if they're present, work fine with silent protagonists as the games are just simple, effective, and fun. They're video game-ass video games, and that the silent protagonist aspect even reinforces that since it's, as far as I know, a narrative device exclusive to this medium. The Legend of Zelda series and Super Mario series come to mind as classic examples of this, though please keep the Zelda series in mind as I get into the main bits of this video. And yes, Mario is a silent protagonist, though he certainly skirts the line and you'll see why. There are also strong cases for using a silent protagonist in instances of novelty, like in the original Half-Life, or in instances of story reasons rooted in deconstructive or satirical intent, like in the original Drakengard or Undertale. But then apart from design and artistic reasons for a game to include a silent protag, since this whole discussion is at the creator, developer, publisher side of things, production considerations, meaning budget, resources, and or time, are a huge factor to every aspect of a game, and that a protagonist could be made silent because of such reasons. The notion of foregoing such a focal and potentially critical element may sound strange, but fat's gotta be trimmed where it can in game development, and as I said, speech is not always necessary for a game's protagonist, so I'm sure there are plenty of instances where the silence wasn't so much a desire as much as it was a concession in favor of the rest of the project, which I like to tell myself is why Astral Chain has one of the strangest instances, or at least strangest single moment involving a silent protagonist in any game I've ever played, which brings me to this case study's main topic. While there are plenty of strong reasons to feature a silent protagonist, over the last year or so, I've personally run into numerous outliers that are strange, questionable, and outright detrimental cases of a game with a silent protagonist, and that because of these run-ins, I've become obsessed with them and gone mad attempting to figure out why their protagonists didn't just speak. And now, having finally gotten my thoughts together and needing to purge this topic and these instances from my mind, I want to talk about how these cases demonstrate that context is everything. That silent protagonists are not the one-size-fits-all narrative device they may seem to be due to their affluent use. That some common denoted reasons for a character being silent are fallacious, and that above all else, I simply want to make people aware that familiarity and convention are not good enough reasons as to why a game should feature this antiquated narrative device. And of course, also to argue why the protagonists in these cases, as well as many others like them, aren't just spoken instead. Now, I'm going to come off pretty harsh from here on, so just know that I don't necessarily hate any of these games, and that even if I personally have a preference for spoken protagonists, I ask you please remember what I've said and how reasonable I've said it up to this point. Oh, and in case it wasn't clear, I'm not talking about literally silent protagonists, but ones that have no explicit contribution to the narrative, and that their dialogue and thoughts are typically seen from dialogue options or implied from body language even if nothing is said. Or you get their feelings from something like a third-person limited point of view narration, which you see pretty often in, well, the first game I'm going to talk about, which is easily the meatiest case I'm going to be getting into, and that is Persona 5, including Royal, as well as its predecessors to a lesser degree. So, let's get into it, and minor spoiler warning for any game I start to talk about. Persona 5's player character Joker, or Bankai Okizeme as he was known in my playthrough of Royal, isn't the worst case of a silent protagonist I've ever run into, but he may be the most peculiar of the bunch for many reasons, with the most standout factor being that, well, he isn't a silent protagonist, as he speaks unprompted a handful of times throughout the game, namely in a few of the animated cutscenes and during the grand finale. And while not spoken out loud, his thoughts are explicitly stated during the segments of the game where Morgana isn't around to act as his consciousness. Yet despite this, he has insisted to be a silent protagonist. Now, I understand these are outliers in a much grander presentation, but that presentation is a silent one, making these instances that are no more than whispers all the more noticeable. And you know someone had to write or at least give the okay for these scenes with these lines to be created, so it's hard not to wonder why they were even included when otherwise Joker goes through the same motions of other silent protagonists. Well, sort of goes through the same motions, and that's really where Joker as a silent protag falls apart. As well, he's insisted to be a silent protagonist given his surface level presentation, including the sense of agency the player is given over this character. At a deeper level, his implementation doesn't work in favor of the silence, as he demonstrates an incredibly predefined disposition supported by a backstory that's reinforced throughout the game, especially in his rivalry with Akechi. It's also clear the narrative can't shift at all since it uses an end media res opening that clearly conveys this character had made numerous decisions regardless of the player to reach this point, to reach the interrogation. And not to mention, he's clearly depicted with a certain personality in mind that's reflected in his mannerisms, dialogue options, and the frequent bark lines you hear him spout in reaction to things. For a silent protagonist, he's got some seriously colorful body language and emotional repertoire, so naturally the question is, why isn't he a completely spoken protagonist then? Oh, and also, while this isn't a definitive point, some cut content for Royal has been salvaged, and in one such case, there appears to be a moment where Joker would have spoken on his own in a regular in-game scene, not an animated one. I won't show it for spoiler reasons, but I'll just say it leans into a certain aspect of this game that plenty of doujinshi artists have capitalized on. And maybe it was cut to avoid giving people any more fuel to work with than they already have. A link to the scene is in the description for those who haven't seen it. But to get back on topic, while attempting to reason out why Joker's handling is such a peculiar case, I find myself believing it must be some attempt to begin breaking the mold of some cultural, industrial, or maybe even personal developer block, or that the creators are attempting to expose fans to the idea so that the possible jump to a spoken protagonist doesn't cause some primal uproar. Yet, the Persona series has numerous well-received instances of their protagonists speaking. In fact, the anime renditions of these characters are widely considered the canon versions of them, at least in name, which I believe can be heavily attributed to 4's anime and fighting game keeping a consistent name for a character I had only ever known as Poon Dragoon. Well, I wish that was true. I played the fighting game first. But anyway, I don't know about P1. I really don't know about P1, I should do that research, but 2, 3, and 4 all had speaking renditions of their protagonists in some prominent form of media before the release of 5. And hell, now that I think about it, 5 had a prominent form of its protagonist speaking before its own fucking release. It had that single anime episode called Daybreakers that released about a month before it did in Japan, before the game released in Japan. And also, at the Persona concert when the first major trailer was shown off for the game, Joker was the one speaking to the audience leading up to the reveal. I forgot about this. I had to go back into the script and rewrite this section. It's so weird. More stuff keeps popping up. Next time I'm gonna find out that he actually did speak the entire game and that I actually am fucking crazy. God. But the point is, even though it wasn't necessarily in-game depictions, there's still a familiar precedent for Persona protagonists to speak. Though even in each game, the dialogue options given often provide these characters unique traits that players internalize as the character's personality, even if the lines are never directly spoken. Though P5 has a serious issue with these options, since it certainly seems like the game doesn't want you to choose them. But before getting more into that, since I am here to purge my mind of all thoughts on these topics, While P5's handling of its protagonist might be the most peculiar case I've run into, when compared to the rest of its own series, it might not even be the worst, as Persona 2 exists, sort of. So for those who don't know, there's a Persona game before 3, and it's called Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. And what's more, check this out, is that before that game is Persona 2 Innocent Sin. That's right, Persona 2 is a duology, starting with Innocent Sin and followed by Eternal Punishment. In the first of the two, you play as the silent protagonist Tatsuya Suo, who then goes on to be not the protagonist, but instead a major spoken character in the second game. Eternal Punishment's protagonist role is instead filled by Maya Amano, who is probably the most prominent major speaking character in Innocent Sin, but despite that, guess what? She's silent in Eternal Punishment. Baffling, right? Almost as baffling as the revelation there's a Persona 2, I'm sure. But it's interesting how one way this works, as it's fine if a silent protagonist eventually speaks, but one that already does shouldn't become silent as, to use some Persona rules, my cognition has changed in awareness of this character's personality and voice. So just because they're silent doesn't mean I'll suddenly unknow who they are, or at least what their general disposition is. And because of that, it's not like I'll be able to self-insert or project onto them as is typically intended with a silent character. It doesn't fucking make sense. Now I know in P2's context there's a semblance of reason for all this. A little bit, just a tiny bit. However, it still doesn't work. But to go further down this rabbit hole and even get off the topic of Persona for a moment, P2 isn't even the worst case of that kind of protagonist handling I've run into, if you can believe it. Which just makes me worried for how many other unreasonable and questionable instances of silent protag handling there is out there that I just haven't come across. But the instance I speak of is a little game that never got localized outside of Japan, a game called Mother 3, the sequel to Earthbound. Now this video is not intended to be a Trojan horse in order to rag on Mother 3, even if it kinda ends up being that, but I attempted to play this game about a year ago because, well, there's something odd that ticks inside me when there's a character in Smash I like playing but know nothing about them, so I feel this inclination to check their game out, and it didn't go over so well. But I knew what I was getting into, as at some point prior I had played some of Earthbound and bounced off pretty hard, but even then, I was still completely dumbfounded and whiplash-ridden from the bizarre handling of the frequent player character swapping that Mother 3 does. As for about half of this game, and especially early on, you switch between player characters often, and for some unfathomable reason, just because you have control of this character, they become an unresponsive, lifeless husk, despite these characters being incredibly colorful and well-defined otherwise. And I thought this shit was a joke, because this game has some eerie, weird tones, and that doing weird, unreasonable shit with its player character was going to amount to something. And maybe that's because I had played Undertale prior, and that game is clearly inspired by the Mother series, except with good gameplay and music, so maybe I just psyched myself up for something. However, it was still inexplicable as to why these spoken characters must have been silent when the player is given control. It makes no goddamn sense. Sorry to all of you out there who want people to see how good and actually bad this game is, but game kinda sucks. HP depleting over time rather than instantly is pretty fucking neat though, I'll give it that. But anyway, out of the hole and back on track we go. In the case of Persona 5, there's a particular endgame aspect that, despite the rest of Joker's handling, would have been bad regardless, and that games with spoken protagonists even handled this better, despite this component being somewhat synonymous with the inclusion of a silent protagonist. Of which I'm talking about dialogue options, but more importantly, what they affect. I can't say this with certainty, as I did not count and I'm not going to because that's a lot of video game, but from what I remember and the impression it left, most dialogue options in P5 were generally meaningless and acted as flavor or a way to inquire about something more than anything, and that these options were often presented as either A, two ways to say the same thing with slight difference, or B, the worst case, being provided two mundane options alongside a third unique choice that's usually a quirky, funny, or smart-ass response. that if the player happens to pick over the correct choice in the scenario, the reception to such statements is rarely positive, with your supposed friends and cat making sure to let you, the player, know how unbecoming it is of the coolest, smartest, hottest, leaderest person in the world to show a degree of quirk, eccentricity, or God forbid, humor. Which not only makes me, the player, feel these options aren't meant to be picked and that there's an intended personality for Joker, making it all the more questionable as to why he isn't just spoken then, but it also paints much of the cast as lame, superficial sticks in the mud that exist to tell Joker, meaning the player, how incredible they are for essentially being able to breathe. It comes off very patronizing. Like, I'm all for a pat on the back. In fact, I could use one. The frequent praise just comes off as superficial and disingenuous, which is rarely what I'm looking for. I just want something genuine. God, I fucking hate that anime. Oh my god, a third season's airing. Anyway, I'm definitely exaggerating here, but this game does have a serious issue with inflexible character responses, and apparently the codename Joker doesn't mean much and that Yusuke is the only one allowed to be funny. Though God bless him, Kasumi, and especially Haru for being able to take a fucking joke. Most of the time, anyway. And I'd say people are sleeping on Haru's character, but the game didn't do her any favors with her implementation. But seriously, Persona 5 has an issue with there being correct answers in a game that is 99.9% flavor picks. I feel that if no game system is being affected, and if the choice is within reason given the scenario, reading the room in a game like this makes sense, that any choice should be viable, and that the reactions given line up with the tone or personality of the option picked. Meaning, like, if I choose the funny option, that means I should get to see some decent banter among the supposed group of friends. Though maybe I'm just an outlier thinking that close friends communicate through stupid banter, and that the punchline in these scenarios was the responder not taking to whatever the choice was. Haha, I said the stupid thing and they didn't like it. That's so funny, man. But to get back on topic, all this is to simply ask, why have such worthless dialogue options in the first place if there's a heavily suggested, arguably intended way for Joker to be played? Let's use Cloud's Strife and FF7's dialogue options, or more so his action options. They're kind of synonymous when I say them, as a comparison here. Original, not remake, though plenty of this holds true in the remake, thankfully. Cloud is a spoken protagonist, and that much like Joker, he shifts between the flashy action hero side of his personality to his aloof and seemingly disinterested side throughout FF7. And that with this, and despite his incredibly complex backstory and complicated identity, the player is given frequent choices to make as to what Cloud should do or say in a given scenario. And while many are simply flavor to keep a player engaged during non-combat segments, most of the choices have significant, or at least tangible payoff, as scenes are frequently altered or rewards given based on the options chosen. Now, this isn't to say P5 lacks meaningful decisions, it's just that the ones that end up mattering are book-ended story choices that simply lead to superficial alternate endings and scenes, rather than the game having a plethora of minor decisions throughout that could shift the tone of how characters feel in a given situation, or at least reward the player in some way. Though, tying rewards to role-playing can be a tough line to walk, as the player may end up choosing options out of incentive rather than intrinsic leanings. But more on that in a second. The point of this comparison to Cloud and FF7 is to demonstrate that silence is not synonymous or necessary with the inclusion of dialogue options, and that a game with a spoken protagonist can provide a more dynamic story influenced by player choice than a game with a silent one. And if anything, I think the dialogue options are part of the reason people love Cloud so much. And God, do people like him a lot. I mean, he is the pinnacle of love a protagonist can receive. Everyone loves that dude, and if they don't, it's because they've only played Kingdom Hearts or watched Advent... I can't say that word. I can never say this word. It's a cursed word. Advent Children, instead of playing the game he's actually in. But more to the point, it's not like Persona 5 or Joker or the player's experience will be devastated by Joker speaking. If anything, I believe it would only elevate people's potential love for that character in game. But back on the topic of incentivized dialogue options, Persona 5 has a terrible case of this with its confidant system and events, wherein many of the dialogue choices have affection points tied to them. That while the ultimate goal of these events may be to give the player an emulated, unique, and engaging relationship to build with these characters, due to the nature of the dialogue options, The player is disincentivized to choose the option they feel inclined towards and instead pick the one that expedites the rank-up process. That instead of building these character relationships in the player's preferred way or through dynamic means, Joker is ideally played as a magic 8-ball for these people, telling them in as few words as possible what they want to hear, not even what they need to hear or what I want to tell them. And then of course, since Joker is silent, they just talk at him until he nods once or parrots a key word from a previous event, and suddenly their whole life is turned around. Also doesn't help that many of these relationships are founded on an ulterior motive. You are using them to benefit the Phantom Thieves first and be their friends second. So even if good ultimately does come from these relationships, and that the two-way accomplice dynamic is fascinating, it's hard not to look at this whole design in a cynical manner. At least in P3 and 4's cases, social links appear to start naturally, and that the in-game reasoning for hanging out and helping these people seems to be driven by altruism and spiritual fulfillment, not better drugs and band-aids. No. I guess that depends on what an individual values. So all this is to say, a silent protagonist isn't needed with the inclusion of role-playing elements and player choice, and that Persona 5's presentation and structure shares more trappings with that of games with spoken player characters than those with silent ones. Now just to clarify, I'm not saying that if Joker's voice was essentially turned on with how the game was finalized that it would fix these issues. The problems that stem from this narrative choice run deep at a conceptual design level, so my sentiment and hope here is that if development had progressed without the constraints and considerations that a silent protagonist infects the rest of the design with, and that the direction for other elements was mostly the same, that this game would have been substantially better for it, and that maybe the critical issues I have with the confidence dynamic of socially engineering your way to the end of these relationships wouldn't have had as much bite as it does, as Joker would at least be talking to these people rather than saying almost nothing to them. Now, I'm sure, but God, I hope not, that one of you watching this has been thinking about at least one, but possibly both, of two of the most commonly denoted arguments and reasons as to why Japanese devs in particular like to choose silent protagonists over spoken ones. The first of which is a horrifying topic that exceeds all tangible backings that I've been working with, as it's the notion that a game features a silent protagonist because of its target audience or demographic needing a blank slate to project onto, because these people lack, or rather possess, a warped personality, one that's quite detached from reality. That when these people play games, their escapism ego takes over, and that if the character they're playing as speaks, the dysphoria kicks in and their entire experience is ruined. I'm definitely exaggerating a bit, but, well, maybe I'm not. Moderation seems to be a foreign concept in practice to a lot of people. But while I think this notion holds a lot of weight, it's an issue that stems or was born from people playing games like Persona 5, where they're given a character to play as that's highly idealized, whether that be their personality, looks, surrounding scenario, or all of the above. When the character's made silent as well, this tells the player they are this incredibly idealized character, thus nurturing this twisted demographic of players. It's escapism. Can't you see? It's not healthy! And hell, if you played P5R Royal, I hope the point of that game's new endgame didn't go over your head. And devs, please never design a part of your game with these people in mind. You aren't helping them. Though I'm sure that's falling on deaf ears. So then the second argument I often see that is fallacious and falls hand in hand with the idea of accommodating a twisted demographic is that this game has a silent protagonist because it has... God, I love this argument. Dating elements. God. This argument is so fucking hilarious because the dating aspect in Persona is so minute, inconsequential, and superfluous. But more importantly, it's because games that have dating elements usually follow spoken, individual, idealized protagonists. And I'm not even talking about visual novels, because once again, FF7 has better dating elements than Persona does, or at least ones that feel significant and goddamn genuine. So to anyone who happens to feel this fallacy is true, instead of imploring you to play a real SMT as I normally would, or to play a Persona game while you're at it, I instead implore you to play a game with some real fucking dating elements, and I mean that literally. But really, this is all to say, maybe the silence is what's causing such shallow implementation of the dating elements in Persona. Or maybe just the shallowness of the social aspects in those games overall. But to bring this all together, my main point here is that the parts that players latch onto most with a given player character, the protagonist, are the idealized bits. The things about the protagonist that the player wishes to have or fantasizes to be, not the parts where the character is vacant. Which finally leads me to one of this case study's cruces. To actualize an experience effectively, silence and thus protagonist vacancy is unneeded, as due to the interactive nature of games on virtue of character control, an experience is always actualized to some degree, and that a spoken protagonist can be just as, if not more effective at doing this than a silent one, especially in the types of silent instances I've been talking about. Instances with strong predefinition of the player character or player characters that I strongly feel if they simply spoke, even if just sometimes, they don't have to talk a lot, that players could feel as fulfilled, if not more than they already can with the experience, as providing a player an idealized role and character to actualize this experience through, while they also develop an empathetic connection to this player character, is profoundly powerful and proven to be such, as well as healthier since there is still a degree of separation between the player and character, avoiding any ego warping. Once again, my boy Cloud Strife is a prime example of this, and frankly an excellent model for a protagonist, as he is cool as fuck on the surface level but harbors immense depth beneath, and that players can create their own unique personal rendition of Cloud within their hearts and mind with the provided agency over him. That their flavor of Cloud is special to them. All this meaning that the self-insert factor is possible without the need to vacate the protagonist with silence, and that it can be more effective than otherwise. But do keep in mind that context is everything, so there's no hard and fast rule with all this. I just want people to understand that silence is not always golden, and that more than anything, I just want things to be the best they can when considering their holistic value. That said, let's move on to discussing some RPG semantics before I start tearing into another game that is very much like Persona. A bit too much, maybe. Now, the term RPG covers a lot of ground, but I think at a high-level technical definition of the genre, as well as the more colloquially used definitions, it boils down to a game that features agency and customization of one or more central game entities to a significant and continuous degree, and that there's also a story focus with a through line and numerous possible interactions with the game space and world, typically with its characters. And among this classification, I think some subtypes are needed in more technical, less cultural senses, meaning definitions that are better than just Western RPGs or Japanese RPGs. So if I may be so bold, I'd like to pose the categorization that RPGs are either role-choosing games or role-filling games, the latter of which are games like ones I've been talking about, like Final Fantasy and Persona. But then this category also includes games like Dragon Quest and even The Legend of Zelda, two series that carry a heavy legacy of silent protagonists and are potentially even to blame for how deeply rooted this trope is in the Japanese game industry. But even with such a legacy, their most recent games also carry bizarre instances and outcries involving their silent protagonists, that once again, it's like they're fighting something, trying to climb out of this hole they dug themselves into. In Breath of the Wild, Zelda's diary is basically just a means of acknowledging and teasing the prospect of Link speaking after all these years, with fans being very receptive to this notion because Link's always been heavily established as a person and demonstrates colorful emotion, and also because, fuck it, why not? It's something new and fresh, it's not going to ruin the series. Dragon Quest XI. I can't say for certain on this one, as this could just be an ongoing gag that has been present throughout the entire series, and I've only played 11, but regardless, in that game, there are action options that block progress and cycle back to the proposition until the correct, mandatory option is picked, and this is done so in an elaborate, cheeky manner each time, telling the player to rethink that, or you don't really mean that, right? Usually involving a character overreacting with a physical gag to the protagonist's denial of whatever the proposition is. And while yeah, it's cute, it's still poking fun at the idea of a silent protagonist that lacks any worthwhile agency, which I feel shatters whatever illusion this game was attempting to maintain with its silent protagonist, and that their silence is now all the more questionable because of it. So that all said, let me finally give my answers as to why I believe these games have silent protagonists. There's two possible answers here, one of which is simply incompetence, meaning poor judgment, poor design sensibilities, and/or an overall lack of holistic insight when making decisions. I'm sure there's numerous true cases of this, one of which I'll get into soon, but I like to give the actual developers the benefit of the doubt when it comes to their abilities to make important design choices. The second answer, though, probably comes from more executive places, and it's something much harder to qualify as it's something born from natural human beings that is found throughout all decision-making every second of every day. That it wasn't incompetence that caused such a poor decision, but was instead a decision that was made without consideration for a game's holistic design and value, and instead was made out of fear, derivation, or complacency, amounting to the pathetic creative killing sentiment, because that's just how it is. You know, it be that way. Begging the question. Easily the worst argument to back an action there is. Now I could get real deep into this subject, and I'm probably going to anyway, but I'll keep it simple by saying that people are often helpless to the familiar and resistant to the unknown, and that risk aversion affects everything. So everyone, players, developers, publishers, whoever, just stay humble, count to 1, and keep a level head. If we do that, I think this two-way street of an industry will be much better off for it, and that individuals will be happier as well. But on a much more personal and individually targeted note, since I know that most, if not all of you need to hear this, do yourself a favor and go play, watch, read, or do something new for once instead of staying caught up in the familiar. Chances are, your new favorite thing is out there waiting for you, and believe me, it's a wonderful feeling to find it while knowing that there's still so many things out there to check out. But anyway, to continue on the topic of being open to new takes on elements within a series, there is the possible instance of the inverse of what I've mostly been arguing about, that may be out there. There's a game with a spoken protagonist that doesn't fit into the rest of the game's mold, and that silence would be ideal instead of speech for them. Now, I don't know of any instances exactly like that, but I do know of something similar in which the 16th entry in a series full of spoken protagonists, 7th game does not count, makes the absurd and regressive change to feature a silent one instead, that I can only assume was done so out of derivation of the Persona and SMT series because, hey, worked for them, and we're doing similar stuff with the calendar system, social elements, and alignment routes, so we must include a silent protagonist as it's simply part of the formula. Well, Fire Emblem Three Houses, your heart's in the right place because goddamn is that the right direction to move in, but holy shit was the mark missed in a lot of places, especially and namely with Byleth's handling. Now, I'd love to joke about how on point people calling Three Houses Shin Megami Sensei is. However, A, it makes me think of the SMT Cross Fire Emblem game that never came out. Shut up, it never came out, fuck you. And B, how much I wish this name actually was on point and how much fucking better this game would have been if it was more like SMT than Persona with its story structure and handling of its silent protagonist. And yes, while I'm sure it's a bit surprising to hear at this point, that was a positive sentiment towards an instance of a silent protagonist, as the SMT series, at least in my experience, are prime cases of such, as I don't believe the extreme tone and absurd personality it demonstrates would be as good if the player character wasn't silent. So that said, let me jump back to the role choosing versus role filling classifications I mentioned earlier, before I continue beating on Byleth and Three Houses for the rest of the video, as I want to better depict those classifications, and because SMT's placement within the categories is worth noting. Now these aren't cut and dry classifications, so they're best depicted as ends of a spectrum rather than something that demonstrates and categorizes with all or nothing means. The basic idea is that while all games under the RPG umbrella share similar core elements of player agency, customization, as well as considerable narrative or world-building focus, that the degree of influence the player has on the protagonist, and in turn, how much the game accommodates or reacts to such influence, determines where on the spectrum a game ends up, with games harboring stricter agency leaning towards the role-filling side, and games with significant and substantial agency leaning towards the role-choosing end. The idea being that you are given a role to fill versus given roles to choose. And to further clarify, I've been arguing that games leaning to the filling side would work fine, if not better in some cases, with spoken protagonists, whereas games mentioned at the beginning like Monster Hunter, Souls games, and MMOs fall to the choosing side as they literally feature many roles to choose from in some form. But once again, not cut and dry, context is everything. The reason I bring this back up alongside Shin Megami Tensei is because the SMT games typically fall somewhere in the middle of the two categories and are great examples of how to utilize a silent protagonist despite the player character having plenty of predefined aspects, with the key factor in the game being the alignment system. And that with it, the game's dialogue options and player choices carry significant weight, as they're loaded onto a multi-sided scale that points a moral compass, with all these choices eventually amounting to some form of heavy narrative shift and route divergence, which provide incredible realization and fulfillment of whatever role the player had leaned into, resulting in some of the highest highs I've ever felt from anything. And also, as mentioned, the game's got some seriously weird personality when it comes to demon interactions, and that shit being spoken might lose a bit of the surreal bite, though it'd likely be traded for campiness, and hearing my SMT character scream at the top of their lungs attempting to sway a demon sounds like a good time still. But anyway, let's get back to Three Houses. So I bring up SMT not only to exemplify what I believe are strong cases of silent protagonists, but because Three Houses has many of the key trappings that make SMT games so exceptional. But instead of treading down that route or following its own well-thought-out structure and designs, it instead ignores such things and throws such potential to the wayside in favor of deriving from Persona, the more socially focused and, frankly, successful series. Which does make sense considering the natural direction Fire Emblem has been heading after its success with the big can of waifu bait it cracked open with the marriage system in Awakening. In fact, I think people were even hoping for a large leap in that direction, the more socially focused direction. It's just that, when you go to copy homework, you need to check the fucking work, because it looks real bad if you turn something in with the same wrong answers as the thing you're copying. Though I suppose in this case, if you turn something in with somehow worse answers, there is some plausible deniability, and that all these issues that happen to be nearly identical to another game were simply happenstance born from incompetence. But I find that unlikely, even if incompetence is still clearly a factor here, as Byleth shares way too many of the same flaws as the protagonist of a similar game that runs on a calendar system with social focus in a contained hub setting that also released around the early development periods of Three Houses. Though I do hear that Three Houses is quite comparable to the Legends of Cold Steel games. Wait. Trails of Cold Steel games. Legends of Cold Steel is probably a story on DeviantArt. But whatever, I'm not playing those games for like another 5 years, so I can't say for sure. All I know is that Rian sounds fucking terrible. Absolutely terrible. But anyway, I have to believe in a series that had nothing but spoken protagonists that the regressive act of silencing Byleth was an attempt to mimic the success that a similar game found. Or maybe it was just to appeal to those familiar with Persona, that they'll feel right at home when playing a Fire Emblem for the first time. It's hard to say, but copied or not, Three Houses has some serious issues with its execution of concepts. So enough of the why, let's get into the what and how. So to put it simply, much like Persona 5, Three Houses goes through the motions of having a silent protagonist while the implementation of its parts don't match up to this. But unlike Persona 5, Three Houses is founded on a route system and provides an actual blank slate of a protagonist, so it's got the makings of what could be an intense, dynamic role-playing game. Which means that the sins this game commits with its dialogue options and player character are significantly graver than that of a case where it's simply odd the player character doesn't talk, as these issues are defined by wasted potential and detrimental factors. So while the first case was more so about why not let the protagonist talk, and that sentiment certainly carries over into this one, the main focus here is to discuss a case in which the silence is almost completely, if not completely, worthless, that you really can't just go through the motions and hope it works out. So let's start with one of the greatest offenses Three Houses commits, that being the design of its dialogue options. Though part of what I want to discuss here can't even be considered as such since, well, unless I'm insane, I'm pretty sure you need at least 2 choices when an option prompt appears for it to be considered a set of dialogue options, as it wouldn't make sense for there to ever just be a single option that pops up, right? You need at least 2. It wouldn't be an option or choice then. It's just a confirm prompt at that point, so why not just have the character say it instead if there's not even a semblance of an illusion of a choice here? But thankfully, since that's a ridiculous prospect, no game, or anything for that matter, would ever do that, right? Right? I think my sarcasm is loud enough here to get my point across, so there's not much else to say except that, well, this greatly embodies the gravest sin Three Houses commits with its protagonist. As while Joker can at least be played to some flavor, Byleth is given no such thing. Whether it's the options provided or systems surrounding such things, there is nothing in this game outside of a choice at the beginning of the game and a choice at the end of the game that the player can define anything about this character with. And hell, in one of those choices, that being the Three Houses part of a game called Three Houses, though they should have gone with the near literal translation of the Japanese title in my opinion, way better. Seasons of Warfare sounds way cooler than Three Houses. This shallow gamble of a choice, one that occurs almost immediately and completely locks the playthrough onto a predetermined path, one that the game doesn't provide ample time for the player to make an educated decision on, such a choice is all it takes to completely define Byleth's disposition, alignments, and the characters they care about for the whole playthrough. And while that might be fine if they spoke, they don't. Meaning all the dialogue options provided come off as presumptuous. That since this character is silent, the game is assuming that because I chose the house I did based on what was basically a coin flip, a dice roll, that these options being given are how I feel about all that's happened or going on in the story or given scenario. And if that sounds ridiculous, well guess what? You're right. The idea of a silent protagonist is to rend the player character of their voice so that the player may express themselves in their stead. But when it's handled like this, the character isn't a vehicle as much as they are a prison. So these options feel more like a way to convey to the player how Byleth feels at any given time than they are ways for the player to individualize this boring husk. I remember somewhat clearly that in part 2 of the Golden Deer route, spoilers for that suddenly Byleth was super concerned and infatuated with Rhea, despite me personally never consciously choosing anything in favor of her. I swear, there was even a set of choices, which was just 2 options as it is with most of the sets of choices in this game, and they pretty much always said the same thing slightly differently. Sounds kind of familiar, right? And that was even the case here, because I remember there being a conversation, I think with my main man Sedith, where the options given were like, I hope Rhea's okay, and we need to find Rhea. Thankfully, this wasn't a nightmare scenario where I hated Rhea and now had to see my silent player character, meaning me, show frequent concern for this person suddenly despite my hate for them, so luckily I was at most indifferent to her. But regardless, at the very least, it felt like options kept popping up as if to tell me that this is what I should be choosing and that this is how Byleth feels. It's so many extra steps for something that would have worked fine and is known to work fine considering the rest of this series if the protagonist just spoke. But if we want to talk about shared issues with P5, this game is all about social engineering and people-pleasing. Like, fuck man, 95% of the dialogue options in this game have affection/support points tied to them. 2 choices pop up, you flip that fucking coin, and you hope you pick the right one, or else you don't get the point, and you have to listen to the character give something of a natural, interesting response rather than simply saying, "Oh, thanks, Professor." Though there are certainly some interesting conversations when picking the right answer, but unfortunately they felt few and far between, and the bottom line is that, once again, this kind of design for dialogue options in a game with a silent protagonist is a poor way to handle things, even if there is something satisfying and engaging about figuring out what kind of responses each character happens to take to. I just don't want to feel like picking the thing I want to is the wrong choice. Not in this sense, anyway. But what's more of an issue following that line of thought is the horrendous route system this game is founded on. I know I've alluded to this a lot, so let's actually get to it. That despite this game focusing on factional alignments whose story, characters, themes, and inner workings won't be well known without considerable time to learn such things, the player must choose a house and therefore a locked route almost immediately. And chances are by the time they realize this house happens to not be for them, if it happens to not be for them, they're in too deep and are unlikely to back down now and start over. Plus, Part 1's story drags so long and alludes to so much, it's gonna be what, 40, 50, 60 hours by the time they hit Part 2 and realize this is where the route's taking them? So they're either gonna fall off or finish it. But it's still just baffling how this game makes such a mistake, especially since the previous non-remake game had a better lead-in and setup with its route system than this one. Though, I don't know if it's considered a system if you have to buy the other routes. Turns out Fire Emblem is a series comprised of nearly all hot messes. And frankly, oh God, I should not go off on this tangent, but here we go. I feel a lot of Edelgard sympathizers and defenders, oh, spoiler warning, a lot of Edelgard sympathizers and defenders aren't defending her as much as they are coping with the fact they were essentially tricked into this dumb bitch's route because of her marketing push, or since the Black Eagles seem to be the default choice in this game, and God knows that there's no way in hell that another player had a good time with the route they gambled on, especially if they picked the fucking Blue Lions. Better put them in their fucking place by lashing out and making a fool of myself. But hey, listen. It's okay. It's okay. You can let go. This game has a shitty route system, so it's not your fault you wasted your time. And hey, I can sympathize. I picked Golden Deer first, and really wasn't feeling it after a bit. But it's not like there was much to work with. It's impossible to know what's going to happen with the character stories and themes in any of these routes based on the shallow info provided. I decided on Golden Deer because A, well, this is everyone's A, girls were cute, and I at least got that one right because goddamn Timeskip Hilda is a whole ass woman, oh my god. And because B, y'all are gonna laugh at this, and B, because of my similarities to Claude. If you can fucking believe it. I'm not showing you what I look like, but I have similar enough hair. I'm nothing if not a smartass, and I've been presumed to be, and desired by others to be, a homosexual, or at least a bisexual, so needless to say, at the onset of this game, I felt a strong draw towards the Golden Deer because of this. But it wasn't anything substantial in game that helped me make this decision, and unfortunately, it all fell apart pretty quickly once Claude started being all hot air. But then I still felt a stronger connection and place in the game world with him than with Byleth, but then Claude starts throwing all that empty praise nonsense at Byleth, oh teacher, the fucking, oh my secret weapon, you can count to 2, God you're so smart. Which takes me out of projecting on both of these characters, and also the theming of the route just ends up lackluster. It was okay, it was a good message, but it's like, where are we going here? So all that plus poor pacing just caused the route to cave in on itself, with the only saving graces being the time skip designs, they look real good, secondary character relationships, which easily the strongest part of the game, hands down, and the last couple of maps on the Golden Deer route were pretty solid too. And thankfully, on a different note, on a related note, Yuri of the Ashen Wolves ends up actually being much of what Claude is said and presented to be, and even plays both sides as people wish Claude to do. Weird how that turned out. But anyway, sorry for the tangent, let's get back on topic and start wrapping this up. So as I've said, the SMT structure is the way to go when making a game like this, meaning that if the first half of this game was simply exposing the player to all 3 houses as well as the church, and that the game provided numerous dialogue options for varying personality playstyles throughout that amalgamate and split the story into strong separate routes as Part 1, White Clouds, finishes, that sounds like a good fucking time to me, and Byleth's silence wouldn't be an issue at all. Well, let's not go that far, but let's just say it wouldn't be, as it ideally would be like an SMT, allowing for the player to make defining character choices that result in massive narrative shifting, as I have discussed. That is, if the writing is at least fitting and solid and options provided varied. Though I do wonder if they actually made Byleth silent for a completely different reason than what I've assumed, and that it was actually in response to how poorly Corrin and Fates' writing was received, so that instead of writing a simple, well-meaning, spoken protagonist, they instead just ripped out the vocal cords entirely, only to fuck it up worse this time around. And that's a harsh statement when I'd rather have something straight up terrible like Corrin than something that ends up representing all the wasted potential of a game's themes and concepts. But I believe the thing that stings the most, at least for me, is that Awakening self-insert avatar character Robin, my Smash main, is an excellent example of a spoken protagonist whose personality works well as a one-size-fits-all, as they harbor simple, well-meaning traits along with a degree of quirk that's demonstrated throughout the different character interactions. And ironically, Robin is basically the professor of their group, so why they didn't just copy this character over verbatim, I don't know. It's a safe move, it's okay. And waifus, husbands, whatevers definitely aren't an argument considering it worked out real good the last 2 fucking games that have spoken protags. And also that element is barely in the fucking game, especially Three Houses. Like, holy shit. Like, you think the game with the spoken protagonist where it's a bigger focus with the children, that's the game you put the silent protagonist in, right? But no, it's like, oh, silent protagonist suddenly, and it's at the very tail end of the game, you get a shitty looking CG, unless it's Hilda's. That one looks fucking nice. But still, it's just, it's so confusing. It doesn't make sense, it doesn't add up, the formula does not equate to what it should. Oh, and also, here's the other thing. Corrin and Robin feature a minor character creator while Byleth doesn't, despite being the silent one. There's another thing. It doesn't add up. Plus, how I would have loved to make Byleth attractive, male or female. I don't like either. It's the fucking clothes. Their outfits are terrible. I hate them. And I am paying for better ones. Honestly, this game didn't need Byleth. I would have preferred just having the 3 lords if the structure was to be as stringent as this. Don't give me hope for something excellent if it won't be delivered on. I do like Three Houses, by the way. I love it even. It might be one of my favorite Fire Emblem games, as weird as that is to say at this point. Fire Emblem's a weird series. There's no golden star of the... There's not even 2 or 3, despite there being so many. There's no golden star of the series. Like, maybe Radiant Dawn? But no, like, every game has fatal flaws to it. But Three Houses is pretty solid all around, even if it has a bad through line. Like, it has exceptional characters, maybe even the best in the series. I love the idea of the school, it's excellent. Like I said, I'm all for the social elements. I prefer less unit customization in Fire Emblem, as it's a series about a player's attachment to the units, and individual classes and abilities help create stronger identities for them, but I appreciate the unique systems and means of growing characters as units to match with the professor-student motif in Three Houses. And of course, it does keep the playthroughs fresh since there's multiple routes. I get that. Just not my preference. And good God, does that game have some fucking world building. It has some outstanding components, all attached to one of the worst through lines I've ever seen. So all this is to say, please, for the love of Saros and her big old booty, let the protagonist of the next non-remake game speak, and let Byleth be buried in this one and leave it at that. Please. Phew. Am I happy to finally get all this shit out of my head. I know this was a bit of a messy case study, especially with the ranting and raving during the Three Houses part, but I hope my main points were made clear, and just know I'm simply looking for things to be the best they can. And also, please just let these characters say anything. Just please let them talk, it's okay. Though once again, context is everything. Now hopefully you all gleaned something insightful from what I've discussed, and also hopefully you enjoyed what was something of a Fire Emblem and SMT crossover. And hopefully it didn't hurt too much being reminded of such things that we never got. But yeah, let me know about any and all weird instances of silent protagonists out there, and definitely let me know if there are any instances where a spoken protag would have been better off silent. That, I need to know. Now, since I mentioned it at the beginning, I do want to end on Astral Chain's particular instance of a silent protagonist. It's in the epilogue of the game, so I figured I'd just close with it for the sake of spoilers, though honestly, the game's story is so unremarkable, even if the presentation's decent, that knowing about this weird shit is more worthwhile than the story. So stick around if you'd like, but otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Okay, so check this shit out. Astral Chain features a pair of twins as the main characters, and the player is given a choice as to whether they want to play as the male or female twin, with whatever one the player picks being a silent character, silent protagonist, and whichever wasn't picked is the game's most prominent speaking character, Akira, meaning the twin not picked speaks and that they're always Akira. So the male and female twins aren't predefined characters, you're effectively choosing the gender of the player character and Akira. But even so, it still comes off strange that there is a possible version of the player's twin that has a voice, so why don't they just talk? Well, they do. As during the epilogue of this game, a voice never heard in such a manner, they do talk in combat, begins narrating the aftermath of this game's events. And who cares what they're saying? It felt like this epilogue existed to bewilder the player with their character suddenly speaking. And as mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've reasoned out that this had to have been a production consideration, and maybe that they at least wanted to let players know in some manner what their character is like. But who knows? Maybe they just thought it was a clever take on something so familiar in the industry. Hard to say. But yeah, I think that'll do it for this video. So, Narukami, take us on out, man.